and it's been 12 years since everything that just has happened. So let's do a little recap on where everyone is. So in the Earnshaw family, Hindley Earnshaw is now dead. He was 27 when he passed, and he left his only son, Hareton Earnshaw, under the protection. Well, he didn't really leave him under the protection of Heathcliff, but that's just what happened. Hareton is destitute and has to live at Wuthering Heights with Heathcliff now as the owner. On the other hand, Catherine Earnshaw, now Cathy Linton, is also dead, unfortunately. She left a husband, Edgar Linton, and her little baby girl, baby Cathy, who was born on the very day that Catherine died. But despite all of these deaths, the next generation has been born. So you know about Hareton, you know about baby Cathy. There's also one other kid now, Linton, who is Heathcliff's son. Heathcliff and Isabella Linton's son. Isabella Linton, even though she is the wife of Heathcliff, she's not really in Wuthering Heights. She ran away. Nobody knows where she is. Edgar Linton, her brother, doesn't want to talk to her. So she's just somewhere out there with Linton. Linton Heathcliff, as if the names aren't confusing enough. So okay, everyone squared away? All right. Mrs. Dean is still telling the story, and she said that those 12 years have been the happiest of her life. Baby Cathy has grown up to be this healthy, cheerful girl. She had the dark eyes of the Earnshaws, but the yellow hair of the Lintons. She had a lot of energy, but never the kind that Catherine, her mom, had. She was gentle, she was kind, she was very tender. She loved deep and tender versus the fiery, fierce love that her mom, Catherine, had. So it's a stark difference. Also, baby Cathy, well, she's now 12 years old. She's very close to her dad. Edgar Linton chose to leave his job, leave everything behind, well, except for Thrushcross Grange. He spent all of his time with baby Cathy. He even taught her everything, homeschooled her, made sure that he spent a lot of time with her. And so, therefore, baby Cathy was a little spoiled. If she was annoyed by a servant in the house, she would always threaten to tell her dad, so that kind of spoiled. But also, baby Cathy was not allowed to leave Thrushcross Grange. Thrushcross Grange was huge, so it wasn't for the lack of space. This kid was not at all caged in. Not only was it just a house, but it had a full real park inside. So beyond that and church, baby Cathy has not seen anything else in the world. Wuthering Heights, which was so close to Thrushcross Grange, was not even a name she knew. And the town where they lived, the town of Gimmerton, was not even a name she knew. All she knew was Thrushcross Grange. So basically like Rapunzel. Baby Cathy loved playing outside in the park. She loved roaming around and looking at birds' nests, looking at rocks, looking at nature. She would ask Mrs. Dean when she could explore outside of Thrushcross Grange, just like Rapunzel, because she could see hills out in the distance. But Mrs. Dean and Edgar Linton would say that, it's just more hills. We have plenty of hills inside Thrushcross Grange. They're all the same. Don't worry about it. Anyway, one day, Thrushcross Grange received news from Isabella Linton that she was dying. Yes, another person is dying. Isabella was sick, and she begged Edgar to come see her so she could say goodbye. And she said she hoped he could secretly take her son Linton, instead of Linton having to go live, rightfully, with his father Heathcliff. Edgar has refused to speak to his sister for 12 years now, but upon hearing the news, he immediately left to go see her this time. Apparently, she ran all the way to London, and so that trip is going to take about 3 weeks in total, and everything was going to be hush-hush because nobody wanted Heathcliff to know all about this. So, for the first time, that meant that Edgar and Cathy was separated. But, it wasn't really a big deal to them at the time. Mrs. Dean wasn't really too worried either. Cathy had played around the park alone so many times, she knew not to go out the gates, and Cathy knew that she had to be back by tea time. So all was well, but one day it was already well into tea time, and Cathy was still not back. Mrs. Dean, of course, started to panic. She and the servants went around the park to find her, and Mrs. Dean found out that Cathy had taken her pony. Yes, she has a pony. And she had snuck out of Thrushcross Grange. Panic. Mrs. Dean's instinct told her that Cathy had gone to those hills that she always talked about. So, okay, great. She was just going to get there. She was just going to find Cathy and she's going to drag her back. But there was one problem. Before reaching those hills, Cathy would have had to pass Wuthering Heights. So that's where Mrs. Dean went. She was like, this is just my luck. More or less, she's gonna be at Wuthering Heights. With her luck, Cathy was probably getting skinned alive right now. So at Wuthering Heights, she knocked on the door, and surprisingly, a servant lady answered the door. Wuthering Heights didn't have a servant lady for a long time, but they have one now, and she was actually very friendly, unlike the rest of the inmates at Wuthering Heights. The servant lady was like, oh, don't worry, she's here, she's safe. And Mrs. Dean was like, but is Heathcliff around? Luckily, Heathcliff was not around, so Mrs. Dean rushed in and she found Cathy laughing and talking to Hareton Earnshaw. Hareton at this point was now 18 years old. He looked just bewildered, like how can such a little girl talk so much? He couldn't even understand half of what she was saying. And so Mrs. Dean freaked out on Cathy. She was like, how could you run away? Your dad is going to kill me. But Cathy was unbothered. She was like, hey, you found me. Have you ever been here before? And Mrs. Dean was in no mood to answer that whole question. She was like, let's get the fuck out of here. But Cathy wouldn't. She ran around the room while Mrs. Dean chased her, and Hareton and Cathy started laughing. They were having fun. But Mrs. Dean was not having any of that. Mrs. Dean was still in a state of panic. Who knows when Heathcliff will be back? She was so stressed out. And finally, she said, if only you were aware whose house this is, you would be running for your life. And Cathy was like, why? Then Cathy turned to Hareton and she asked, it's your dad's house, isn't it? Hareton was embarrassed. He looked down and said, no, because it's not his house. It's now Heathcliff's house, not his family's house. And he didn't say anything. So Cathy pressed on. She was like, so your master's house then? And that was the wrong question to ask. That was a trigger for Hareton. Cathy even turned around to Mrs. Dean and said, if he was the servant all along, why did he keep saying our house? That's not proper. And also, he never called me miss. Hareton looked like he was going to strangle someone. But Cathy made it even worse. This little girl who has never interacted with anyone outside of her house, of course, made it worse. She was like, okay, then servant, go get my horse. And that's when Hareton started cursing Cathy out. He called her a witch, which, isn't that bad. But for Cathy, who was loved and pampered and adored, that was too much. Cathy was shocked, so she yelled right back, telling Hareton that she was gonna tell her dad. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dean was still panicking on the side. She didn't know how much trouble she was in for letting Cathy not just run away, but for letting her go inside Wuthering Heights, of all places. I mean, I feel like it's partly Edgar's fault. He could have just moved. But you know what? Don't move for bullies. All right, so the two kids were fighting, and the nice servant lady at Wuthering Heights had to step in to defend Hareton. She was like, don't be so rude to him. After all, he's your cousin. And with that, Cathy scoffed. She was like, oh, Mrs. Dean, can you believe this? Don't let them say these things. My cousin is in London. He is the son of a gentleman, and my dad is going to fetch him right now and bring him back here. And so Mrs. Dean was like, well, shit. Cathy was for real crying at the thought of having this man as her cousin, while Mrs. Dean was right there thinking about how she should kill herself before Edgar comes home. And Hareton was surprisingly the calmer and bigger person here. He went to get Cathy's pony, and he even offered her a dog, like a dog to keep, a pet, as a gift. But Cathy rejected that peace offering. She was still crying about this man in the ratty clothes and uncivilized language claiming to be related to her. But anyway, Cathy and Mrs. Dean eventually went home, and Mrs. Dean made Cathy promise not to tell Edgar about that trip to Wuthering Heights, because if she does, Edgar would probably fire Mrs. Dean. Murdering her might be more appropriate, Mrs. Dean thought, and Cathy would not be able to see her anymore. And so Cathy promised. Eventually, Edgar arrived back home at Thrushcross Grange. The news was that Isabella had passed away. Edgar was there for it, and Edgar had brought home her son, Linton. Linton, just like his mom, looked weak, sickly, just like Isabella was. Linton was curled up in a carriage when he arrived, and he looked very weak, partly because of the very long trip, and maybe mostly because he was grieving for his mom. And so he was so weak he couldn't even sit on a chair. They had to put him down on cushions so he could be comfortable enough to have dinner. And Cathy adored Linton. She was so excited to have a new playmate, to have a new family member. But Edgar asked her to give him some space just for that night. Linton was so tired. He was distraught. Cathy was probably a stranger to him. Just don't overwhelm him, okay? So the kids went to bed. But that very night, Joseph, one of the servants at Wuthering Heights, came to Thrushcross Grange and demanded that they hand over Linton. He said Heathcliff ordered him that he is not to come home without the boy. Luckily, Edgar was able to fend Joseph off, but not without agreeing to send Linton over to Wuthering Heights the very next day. There wasn't really that much that Edgar could do anyway, since Heathcliff was by law Linton's father. So they actually did it. At 5 a.m. the very next morning, they woke up Linton, put him in a carriage, and started him off to Wuthering Heights. And they made sure it was 5 a.m. so Cathy was still asleep. And actually, they told Linton the truth. He was going to live with his father now. And Linton, upon hearing that, he didn't even know he had a father. He's never heard of him ever. He said growing up, Isabella would always tell him about his uncle Edgar, but never his own father. When they arrived at Wuthering Heights, it was just Mrs. Dean escorting Linton, by the way. Heathcliff was there. He took one look at Linton and laughed at him scornfully. He was like, ugh, this little boy looks worse than I thought. And maybe that was because Linton had all the features of his mom, so the Linton family, but none of Heathcliff's. Also, Linton was very weak, sickly, and that annoyed Heathcliff. So Linton looked terrified. There's this mean man claiming to be his father, and this mean man is saying nasty things about his mom. Mrs. Dean was right there, so she begged Heathcliff to treat Linton well. She was like, this boy is not going to survive this house. But surprisingly, Heathcliff said he would take care of the boy, but not because he loves the boy or anything. It's because this boy is the potential heir to Thrushcross Grange, and Heathcliff will make sure that he gets to have everything that Linton has. Heathcliff is just straight up telling Mrs. Dean all his plans. So remember that Thrushcross Grange doesn't go to baby Cathy. The rules of the inheritance was that if Edgar didn't have a son, then Thrushcross Grange would go to Isabella when he dies. In this case, when Edgar dies, it was going to be going to Linton. And Heathcliff happens to be Linton's father. So hearing the evil plan aside, Mrs. Dean had to leave Wuthering Heights. It wasn't like she could do anything about it. And she remembered, as the door closed, she could only hear Linton screaming for her to take him with her. And that was it. Nothing changed much over the next 3 years. Linton stayed at Wuthering Heights, still very frail and sickly, and Cathy stayed and thrived at Thrushcross Grange. There was actually zero contact. Cathy didn't even know that Linton was at Wuthering Heights. Nobody told her. Nobody told her that her Aunt Isabella was actually married to Heathcliff and they had a son, and that therefore was her cousin. She didn't know anything about that. So one day, 3 years later, so Cathy was about 16 right now. Actually, it was her 16th birthday. She decided that for her birthday, she wanted to explore the moors. So Cathy didn't really celebrate her birthday very much because that was when her mom died. Edgar would usually just lock himself up in the library and be quiet for the day and think about the love of his life. So Catherine was often left on her own. So this year, Cathy wanted to explore the moors and she wanted to take Mrs. Dean with her as a chaperone. So Mrs. Dean went. So they were walking outside of Thrushcross Grange when Cathy at one point started running, and before Mrs. Dean knew it, they were getting close to Wuthering Heights. What's worse is that Mrs. Dean saw from the distance that Cathy had been confronted by 2 men because Cathy was running really fast, and at one point she was out of the view, and Mrs. Dean, when they came to view, she saw that Cathy was in trouble. And apparently they had already entered Wuthering Heights territory, and Cathy had picked up an egg from a nest. So she was now being accused of stealing. Mrs. Dean hurried to Cathy, and of course that man that was confronting her was none other than Heathcliff. Hareton was the second man. He was right there with him too. So at this point, Heathcliff knew. He knew right away that this was Catherine's daughter, given that also Mrs. Dean was running right behind this girl. This was the first time that he had laid eyes on baby Cathy. And Cathy was like, "Hey, I know you. You're Hareton. So is this man your father?" Heathcliff said, "No, that's not my son, but I do have a son, and you've met him before. Come to my house and I'll show you. That's not creepy at all." Mrs. Dean was like, No, Cathy, let's go. It's getting dark. It's getting late. Let's get the fuck out of here. But Cathy wanted to go. She was curious. So Heathcliff grabbed Mrs. Dean's arm and they all walked towards Wuthering Heights. On the way, Mrs. Dean whispered to Heathcliff that she knew he was up to no good. And Heathcliff was like, "Duh, of course. I'll even tell you what my plan is. I want Linton and Cathy to meet. I want them to fall in love and get married." Heathcliff also said that the details of the will does not say who inherits from Linton when Linton dies. So he doesn't know if Thrushcross Grange goes back to Cathy if Linton dies. So to be safe, he wanted Cathy to marry Linton so he could finally get control of Thrushcross Grange. When all of them reached Wuthering Heights, at first, Cathy didn't recognize Linton. I mean, she only saw him once, 3 years ago. But as soon as Heathcliff told her who he was, Cathy was so excited, she went and hugged Linton and kissed him. The comparison between the two was stark, Mrs. Dean said. Cathy looked plump, slender, healthy, active, and Linton was the complete opposite. He looked frail, he looked sickly. He didn't look like he moved very much at all. He just sat in front of the fire. And although he had a little bit of gentle, delicate grace about him, that was kind of a little endearing, the kind that you would want to nurse, you know? Cathy then turned to Heathcliff and was like, "Hey, that means you're my uncle, right? Why don't you come to visit us? Can't I come visit with my dad?" Heathcliff explained that Edgar actually hates his guts. If she wants to see Linton, she was just going to have to come to Wuthering Heights. She would need to keep this a secret from her dad. And Cathy was like, "Okay, but the quarrel is between you two, so can't Linton come to visit us at Thrushcross Grange instead?" Linton spoke up for the first time. He was like, "Walking 4 miles is too much for me." So Linton asked Cathy if she could come visit instead. But he said, "Not every morning, please. That's too much. Please just come once or twice a week." And with that, Heathcliff glared at his son. He wanted Linton to show some enthusiasm, to show some bravado, to charm this lady. Heathcliff even tried to tell Linton to go take a walk with Cathy, show her some rabbits around the place, but Linton didn't want to. He said he wanted to stay by the fire. So Heathcliff didn't have a choice. He was like, "Okay, let me try this." He went and called Hareton. Maybe Cathy would like Hareton? Hareton is still well under Heathcliff's control anyway, so that would work. But he knew that it was unlikely that Cathy will be attracted to Hareton because of Hareton's degradation, Heathcliff thought. Kind of why Catherine Earnshaw didn't choose Heathcliff those many years ago. Talk about projection, but okay. Hareton came and he wouldn't even speak. He was too shy. He was too embarrassed. He just stood there like a bodyguard for Cathy. So Heathcliff watched Hareton and Cathy, and then he turned to Mrs. Dean. He said, "Look at that boy. He's basically degraded so much now in the exact way that Hindley wanted Heathcliff to be. But this is even better because Hareton is almost proud of the way he is. He doesn't know better because that was the way that Heathcliff meant it to be. This was the way that Hindley wanted Heathcliff to be, but he failed, and now Heathcliff had done it right back and successfully to his own son. And what a success! Heathcliff said he wouldn't even have enjoyed it this much if Hareton weren't secretly smart behind those eyes. Eventually, Linton, who was still by the fire, started to get jealous of Cathy and Hareton outside. He could hear them laughing, looking at rabbits. He used up all of his energy, and he walked out to the door. In that moment, Cathy was asking Hareton what the inscription was on top of the house's door. There was some writing on it, and Hareton was too embarrassed to say anything because he doesn't know how to read. But Cathy was like, "What do you mean? It's English." Linton started giggling. He told Cathy that Hareton can't read. He's uncultured. He's lazy. He's dumb. And Cathy just listened. She looked like she was fascinated and amused. It almost didn't register to her how mean this all was. Meanwhile, Heathcliff and Mrs. Dean could see and hear all of this. Heathcliff, although his plan was now working, he also looked almost triggered by what was going on because this very picture was an accurate depiction of what happened to him when he was younger. So he looked really grim and triggered. The very next day, at Thrushcross Grange, Cathy came clean to her dad, Edgar. She told him everything about how she found out Wuthering Heights and that she knows the people in there and the family basically. She told him she knew that her cousin was right there. One cousin anyway, Linton. She's still in denial about Hareton. And she accused Edgar about never telling her, all because he hated her uncle Heathcliff. To be fair to Edgar, he did tell Cathy everything at this point. He was like, okay, let me explain. Edgar explained the whole history of what happened to Cathy, how they all met as kids, himself, Isabella, Heathcliff, Catherine, Hindley, and up to the point when Isabella married Heathcliff, up to how he and Catherine got married and how Catherine died. He wanted Cathy to understand the why she shouldn't go back and see those people ever again. But Cathy, she didn't understand. This concept of grudges and anger that spans over years was a foreign concept to her. She was pampered growing up. Everything was fairy tales. The worst mistakes that she did were dealt with on the same day. Everyone forgave her and loved her and adored her by the time that it was bedtime. So she couldn't wrap her head around this. That night, Mrs. Dean caught Cathy crying. She was crying not because of the whole family drama or anything, because she didn't understand that, but because she made a promise to Linton that she would see him the very next day, and now she couldn't because Edgar told her never to go back there. She asked Mrs. Dean if she could just send a note, but Mrs. Dean said no. So a few days passed, and one day, Mrs. Dean noticed that Cathy was being super protective of one particular drawer. She usually had her little trinkets, her little toys in it, but now she would always keep it locked. Mrs. Dean also noticed that the insides of the drawer seems to have changed. It seems to now be paper. So one night, when everyone was asleep, Mrs. Dean looked for a house key that would fit in the same lock, and she opened that drawer. It was love letters from Linton, which by the amount of letters that was in there and the tone of the letters, it looked like Cathy was responding right back. Also, the letters from Linton, because Mrs. Dean read a couple of them, the tone also was a little weird. I mean, the wording, the language that being used was less like a teenage boy professing his love or flirting with a girl. It was more formal, flowery, suspiciously old-fashioned. So Mrs. Dean was like, this is not good. Mrs. Dean took all of the letters and hid them. And then she waited. The very next morning, Mrs. Dean was spying on Cathy. She saw Cathy wake up, break of dawn, and Cathy went down to the kitchen and took something from the man who delivers the milk. It was a piece of paper. A little while later, Cathy gasped loudly, and then Cathy asked Mrs. Dean to go up with her to her room. So Mrs. Dean went, and Cathy wasn't even angry. She went on her knees and begged Mrs. Dean not to tell her father about the letters. She said when she started writing to Linton, she didn't expect that she would fall in love with him. Cathy begged Mrs. Dean to do anything but tell her father about it. She would die. She would rather see the letters burned instead. And Mrs. Dean was like, are you serious? You have barely met this boy and you're saying you're in love with him? Like, ew. Mrs. Dean didn't tell Cathy that she wasn't even sure that Linton was writing all those letters. But she said, okay, fine. Since you said that you would rather see the letters burned, okay, let's just burn the letters and I won't tell your father. But there's one more condition. The condition was that Cathy will never write to Linton again. No locks of hair, no little notes, no exchanging of books, no trinkets, nothing. And Cathy was very defeated. She was like, okay, fine, just put them in the fire already. And so, yeah, Mrs. Dean poured the letters into the fireplace. And that was it. That's part 6 of Wuthering Heights. There's still a lot more that's gonna happen, so please stay with me for part 7.